Beach FM, locals talking to locals.
You're on Beach FM and, well, we've got a big decision come 17th of October 2020. Well, a few big decisions anyway, but I am only responsible to bring information about one. We get to vote yes or we get to vote no on the Cannabis Legislation and Control Bill. And I have welcomed to the show, I think, in my humble opinion, the best person to talk about this subject is from the Green Party of Aotearoa. It's Chloe Swarbrick. G'day, Chloe.
Kia ora, Damian, too much. Thank you for that very generous introduction, mate.
Not a problem. I have I've watched a few things, I've listened, and I've just been in awe how you've handled yourself in one and the way you've delivered the information. So why you're here is we need to educate some people in regards to what we're actually voting for on the 17th of October. Apart from all the other stuff, the one thing that we are going to talk about is the Cannabis Legislation and Control Bill. So Chloe, what is it we are voting for on 17th of October?
Great question. Some people would like to characterise this about whether you like cannabis or not, or whether you support cannabis or not. Fact of the matter is, regardless of whether you vote yes or no, cannabis is going to exist in this country. And if you vote no, it will continue to be as readily available as it currently is, whereby under the criminal prohibition status quo, you've got 80% of New Zealanders using cannabis by the age of 21, and around 11% of New Zealanders accessing cannabis on a regular basis. That's around 350,000 to 500,000 Kiwis on a nigh-on weekly basis, getting access to the criminal underground, to tinny houses. You know, drug dealers are not checking ID. So you've got effectively a free-for-all of chaos where unknown people in unknown places are using substances of unknown quality to unknown effect. And effectively what the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill does is say, hey, we've got to be real about this problem, and we've got to recognise that any of the harm that people have seen associated with cannabis has happened under this criminal status quo. So let's provide a situation whereby we can do stuff like control the potency. We can make sure that there is a duty of care applied to people who are selling and supplying it, that there is tax revenue that's generated and used to pay for our schools and our hospitals and our mental health and addiction services, but also so that people are not turned into criminals for accessing an alternative in a recreational sense to the likes of a beer. At the end of the day, some folks say to me, oh, well, you know, no one's going to jail nowadays for cannabis. Well, not if you're white. And that's what all of the data and research shows. You know, the Prime Minister Chief Science Advisor's report that came out about a month ago now showed us that 1,300 Māori are criminalised through criminal convictions per year for low-level cannabis offences. Doesn't mean everyone's going to jail, but what it does mean is that people have a black mark against their name and their record, which serves to be a barrier to getting a lease on a rental property or to starting a business if they choose to go into entrepreneurship, to, for example, travelling, which obviously further impedes people's opportunities to getting a job, and also obviously potentially to education. So, you know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is what my old man calls the definition of stupidity. So if we want to get real and mature about this topic, we need to take it out of the shadows and bring it into the light and deal with it like adults.
I've got a few questions. Firstly, the age is going to be restricted to 20, 21, is that correct? 20.
Yeah,
now,
20.
Now, where did that number come from? I mean, scientific research has proven that the brain doesn't fully develop until 25, and of course, this is one of those drugs that could affect some people, not all people, but some people's brains.
Yeah, totally. And what the research has shown on the fact that the drug can have negative impacts on people's brains, particularly developing brains, is, you know, we actually have some of the best research in the world here in Aotearoa on that. So that comes from the Otago and Canterbury longitudinal studies, which is where I was citing that data around the 80% of New Zealanders using it by the age of 21 years old. That data also shows just how harmful cannabis can be to developing brains. Yeah. And effectively, what you see under that is that all of this harm is happening right now under the criminal status quo, where there's no control over potency, and drug dealers are not checking ID. But you also have an extra issue where people are rubbing shoulders with the criminal underground that may sell them something harsher if they don't have access to cannabis or cannabis on hand. This is how we, of course, ended up with the likes of the synthetics crisis. Now, on the age of 20, we obviously right now have a substance, alcohol, which is available for anybody from the age of 18. Who can present their licence or proof of their age at a liquor shop or otherwise. But the other thing is that we need to take into account, as you stated, that the brain isn't fully developed until the age of 25. Now, theoretically, alcohol should also have the same kind of regulatory scheme applied to it as cannabis. Just so happens that nobody's putting that cat back in the bag. It's very, very fully out. That's not to say that we don't have opportunities to regulate alcohol better through things like banning, advertising and sponsorship, but that's another issue. What it is to say is that when we start regulating a substance which has historically been unregulated, that we have the opportunity to do it right from the get-go. So the purpose of balancing it between those ages of 18, which everything else is effectively available from, and 25, 20 seemed like a pragmatic and practical balancing point whereby we could say this is harmful to you. Arguably, actually, based on World Health Organization data, not as harmful as alcohol can be. But anyway, that we are still going to regulate this properly. And again, on all of these things around mental health and on potential addiction, we also know that, as you were speaking to, approximately 5% of people who do encounter cannabis, which is pretty much all New Zealanders, 80% of us, will not, 5% of all people who access cannabis will end up presenting some form of problem, which means 95% of New Zealanders or people who access cannabis do not end up presenting with some form of problem, whether it's addiction or otherwise. But the best way, again, to regulate this potential harm is to change the current approach that we have to cannabis, which maximises that harm by pushing it into the criminal underground.
Right. So my next one is off money. I've seen some figures of near 500 million on tax would come into the government and be spent on various things. But a lot of the people that I've been talking to is the concern of, is it really going to be spent wisely, what it's going to be spent on, and what are some of those theories of where that money would be earmarked for, if you will?
Yes, a really good question, and this is where it's important to look at the legislation, which I completely understand if most people haven't. It is 162 pages. I did spend nearly 2.5 years of my life pored over it, so it is, it's a bit of legalese, but if anybody wants to know the high-level information on it, you can go to referendums.govt.nz and you'll find some handy bullet points. So there is in this legislation something quite special compared to most other regulatory schemes. There is what's called ring-fenced funding out of the levy that will be applied on cannabis, which means that it cannot be used for anything other than mental health and addiction. So what is really special about that is that you don't see that same kind of ring fencing happening on any other levies or taxes really inside of our current regulated, potentially harmful substances, except for on the likes of pokey machines. But also we know, kind of as you're referring to, we already have a massively underfunded mental health and addiction service scheme out there in the public. So what we don't want to do is end up tagging the increase in funding to mental health and addiction solely from sale of more of this substance. What we want to do is just ensure that it is being paid for right now because it is needed right now. But tagging of that funding, which the Treasury is not a big fan of, primarily just because it wants all of the pot of money to go into one big pot. It doesn't want to deal with the kind of bureaucracy of slightly smaller pots. But what it does do is give the general public peace of mind that this money is definitely going towards one cause. And I guess the flip side of it as well is that right now we spend, I think it's approximately $300 million per year on continued prohibition of cannabis. This is the flying of choppers over grows and spraying them with insecticides. This is police and court time and prosecuting and convicting people, throwing some in jail. So not only is there going to be increased taxation revenue from legalisation and control, there also is going to be a reduction in cost and the reduction in bureaucracy inside the criminal justice system so that they can focus on meaningful crimes.
300 million. Wow. Chloe, there's been a lot of talk over the years. The world has opened up. We've got the World Wide Web. We can look up anything we want now. There's been a lot of talk on CBD, the medicinal side to cannabis, not just the hallucinogenic or, melting into your couch kind of thing. Is this going to open the door for more medical practices in regards to cannabis?
So what you've seen, looking at other jurisdictions that have originally legalised medicinal cannabis and then moved towards, for lack of a better term, a recreational market, whether it's Canada, which 21 or 22 years ago legalised medicinal cannabis, whether it is over in the States and there's 13 or 14 different states that have now moved towards legalised cannabis, is that medicinal cannabis has become more affordable. Right. That's kind of for two reasons. One of them is because, as you say, more people are able to kind of get into the game, but the flip side of it as well is that more cannabis ends up ultimately being produced, and it can be produced to different ends. Another real unfortunate downside to the prohibition of cannabis, as with kind of most substances over the past kind of nearly 70 years, but particularly over the last 50, with the Misuse of Drugs Act, 1975 here in Aotearoa, which is a carbon copy of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1972 from the UK, which is born out of something called the Vienna Convention from the early 1970s, kind of led by the Nixon administration in the United States, and kind of this very conservative war on drugs attempt to effectively criminalise certain communities. And his advisors from that time are on record saying exactly that they knew it was contrary to the evidence and that it was not going to actually stymie the use of these substances. But what we have seen is that there has been an inability to study cannabis, particularly CBD and THC and all of the other what are called cannabinoids, I try and say that quickly, cannabinoids that occur naturally within cannabis. And that has meant that we are light years behind where we should be. There's now a very quick move to play catch-up, but effectively we have a very basic understanding. And what we're starting to see is that despite the very basic baseline binary of people going, CBD is therapeutic and THC is hallucinogenic or, used for recreational means, there is slight greater complexity that's starting to emerge where, for example, you need certain levels of THC, obviously not a huge amount, and that can increase the efficacy of CBD in terms of how it, moves through one's system. And same in the reverse. Increased CBD can obviously offset some of the harsher ends of a recreational kind of use. Yeah. So all of this research has become incredibly important for trying to understand therapeutic measures and implementation of this substance, which is a drug, much like alcohol is a drug, much like, other forms of opioids or painkillers can be and are drugs. So we know that earlier, I think it was at the start of last year, this past year has just kind of faded away with all of the COVID lockdowns, but we had the implementation of the medicinal cannabis scheme here in Aotearoa. And I was a big part of lobbying, negotiating and working through the implementation of that scheme. Now, we didn't win everything that we wanted in that to make it as progressive as possible. And there was a lot of argument and debate about how it may potentially end up being deeply commercialised, which in turn ends up pricing out particularly patients who don't necessarily and don't typically have a huge amount of money to be able to afford that medicine. So we've ended up with kind of a halfway house between the negotiations between obviously the Greens, New Zealand First and Labour, which has created a market that enables local grow and production, which is starting to get, towards economies of scale, which in turn will reduce those costs. But until we actually get to that point where enough is being able to be produced to reduce those costs, it is going to remain outside of the realm of affordable for the majority of people. So here we're still talking about, hundreds of dollars every month. So So that's why still disproportionately a huge number of people are going to what are called green ferries and the criminal underground. People who are effectively risking jail time to do nothing other than helping those in their local community who are experiencing suffering. So under a legal market, there will be greater access to therapeutic cannabis, and there will be greater production of cannabis that is primarily focused in that area of CBD, which in turn enables greater kind of reach towards that economy of scale, which in turn means that it will come down in price. So there's the complicated version of that.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Lastly, Chloe, I know I'm taking up a lot of your time and I know you got very little of it, but lastly, I was going to ask, what are some of the concerns, but more than that, what should people, if they're sitting on the fence, if they're thinking yes or no, like what should people come away from this thinking and knowing?
So there's a few different things which regularly come up. One of them is concerns about mental health and addiction. And on that, all I can say is all of the problems that people have seen cannabis cause right now have occurred under the current system, and that we have an opportunity to do it differently. And actually, if we do want to, actually confront those issues of mental health, then we need to do that in the light. We cannot continue to push people who need help into the shadows. Next to nobody is going to come out and admit that they're doing something illegal if it's causing them harm, if they risk going away in handcuffs. So, in fact, regulating it is the best opportunity that we have to intervening in potentially problematic usage. Another classic is Smoke-Free 2025, people saying, why are you going to introduce cannabis? Yeah. And on that, I can just say, I'm not a magician. I'm not inventing cannabis. What we're doing here is seeking to grapple with a problem that already exists. And the reason that we've got anywhere near close to Smoke-Free 2025 is by virtue of regulation. You do not have control of a substance that is in the black market, and we know that hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders are using it regularly right now. So, in fact, if we want to follow the same kind of logic that we have with tobacco, where we have control over points of sale, where we obviously have control over who can purchase it, where we have control over packaging and the warning labels that are on it, where we can offer people cessation treatment, things like nicotine gum or patches if they're experiencing problems and want to come off it, public health advice, and of course the wraparound kind of enforcement, like for example being unable to smoke in the car with your kids, then actually that's a great argument for cannabis legalisation and control through regulation. The next one is usually along the lines of, we don't want to have another version of alcohol which causes all of these problems in society. And the thing is that alcohol right now has diverged so far along the spectrum of potential regulatory models that it is heavily glamorized, it is heavily normalized. And actually, if we want to peel that back and do the same kind of things that we did, for example, potentially with tobacco, although because it is so prevalent, not go so hardcore, but start to deal with some of those harms and those realities, then we have the opportunity to do that. The big problem that we aren't is because so many politicians are so heavily lobbied. And that kind of brings me to the intersection of power and the kinds of regulations that we end up getting in our market, and probably why there is such a dislike towards engaging in the conversation on cannabis, because it is nuanced, it is complicated, and it requires doing more than the typical rhetoric. So I think, kind of fundamentally on this, what people should know is that when we're dealing with this topic, this is not about engaging in supporting cannabis. You don't have to like cannabis. You don't have to use cannabis. You just have to recognize that cannabis can sometimes, in a small group of instances, cause harm. And right now, our current approach of criminal prohibition is not stopping anybody getting access to that cannabis, and arguably is increasing that harm by criminalising and convicting thousands of New Zealanders every single year. So what we have here with this opportunity for a yes vote is the ability to get control of something that is already happening, to put in place regulations that can wind down that potential harm, and to increase the well-being for our communities, particularly by reducing access to our younger people. So, I just see it as a pretty common sense decision, but a whole lot of people right now are engaged in a whole lot of fear-mongering. And if you need some kind of parallel, it's probably worth thinking about the decriminalisation of prostitution several decades ago.
Yeah.
When we as a country moved towards that decriminalisation, we weren't saying, hey, look, we endorse this action. We weren't saying we support it at all. We were simply saying this happens and we have the opportunity to deal with the reality of that and make people who do it safer.
Chloe, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Lastly, where can people go to find more information?
Yes, the first one would be referendums.govt.nz. Controversially, that was the terminology that they decided to go with. There were a few barneys in the MOJ office, from my understanding, about whether it was referenda or referendums. Yeah. But it's referendums.govt.nz. I'd also highly recommend, if folks want an independent source of information that doesn't tell you how to vote, but does offer you insights into issues around education, around youth usage, around the criminal justice system, then the Prime Minister Chief Science Advisor's independent report. She brought together a whole raft of different experts in this area on public health, on child brain development. You go to pmcsa.govt.nz, I think it is, and you'll find a section on the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill there. And that is a highly recommended source for folks who aren't necessarily sure of the kinds of implementation issues that we may have, who aren't necessarily aware of what's happening in other jurisdictions, and who are interested in not only the substance but in the regulatory approaches that we could take to it.
Fantastic. Chloe Swarbrick, MP for the Green Party of Aotearoa. Go well, my friend. Keep up the great work.
You got it, Ihoa. Catch you later, mate.
106.3 Beach FM.